Okay, great. So we're live. Hello to everybody just coming in now. Happy Thursday. It's it's a sunny day in Toronto. I hope it's similar weather where everybody else is. Thanks for joining us. So we'll just get started in a minute once we have a few more people join us. Perfect. Welcome everybody who's just coming in and joining our webinar. We'll just start just in another minute. All right, welcome everybody again. Hello, happy Thursday again to everyone joining us. We're just going to get started, I think, as everyone just starts to continue to sort of join us here on the webinar. Thank you so much. Great. Okay, so it's 2 o'clock. So my name is Hannah Kaploon, pronouns she and her, and I am the project coordinator at PLEAC. I am located here in Toronto, Ontario, and I would like to acknowledge the land I and others joining us today are on, and it's traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. I want to add as well that June is National Indigenous History Month, so it's especially important to take time now, next month, and onward to reflect on how colonialism has impacted all of our worldviews. Think of how you can support and uplift Indigenous voices and consider donating to a charity or fundraiser, supporting Indigenous folks if you have those resources to do so. If not, be sure to read up on some educational resources found in abundance online, and tell a friend or family member about what you learn. So to introduce why we're all here today, thank you so much for joining us for PLEAC's webinar on supporting trans, non-binary, and gender diverse communities. We have two fantastic speakers today who will give us some insight into this topic. And they are Shila LeBlanc, pronouns she and her, a coordinator for the Standing Together project at the Legal Information Society of Nova Scotia. Thank you so much for joining us. And Shae Morse, pronouns they, them, a teacher, community organizer, and activist. More bio details were included in the registration process, so if you checked it out, please do so, but our speakers will expand on that just in a moment. Before I pass it along to them, there is a survey at the end of this webinar, so please just take a minute out of your day to complete it. This will help us continue to improve our programming. And finally, any questions that you have during this webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A button or chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit those. The speakers will be answering any questions you may have throughout the webinar, so please feel free to chime in at any time. I will be keeping an eye on it and chiming in as that goes along. And the webinar as well is recorded. It will be distributed at the end afterwards as well to everybody who attended. Okay, so without further ado, take it right away.
Yeah, so thanks so much everyone for being here. It's great to have you participating, and we do hope to get your questions. Just before we dive in, I just wanted to tell you a bit about this project specifically that Shae and I are working on. We obviously have a couple different hats that we wear professionally speaking, but one project we're working on is using some provincial funding to create an employer's guide on best practice and kind of plain language legal information to support the Pride community. So it's early days. This project is set to be complete in March of 2022. So obviously things are kind of in the baby phase yet, but we do have a lot of information already about what is some kind of best practice, some easy kind of tools and things that you can start implementing today. So both Shae and I are interested in giving you kind of tangible, practical things that you can start as soon as this webinar is done. Shae will be presenting first around best practice. They will walk us through specifically ways to make space for the queer community. And then I'm going to jump in and speak about restorative approaches. So I'll pass it off to them. And thank you all for being here.
Great. Thank you, Shila. Yeah, I'm honored to be here today. I have a teaching background myself, so Hopefully that'll shine through today. So let me share my screen and we'll get started. Okay, there's that. There's that. So hopefully you're seeing my screen at this point.
Looks great, Shae.
Thank you so much. All right, so I come from Halifax, and I have in my family, I'll just share this before I dive into it. In my family, I've had lawyers all around me my whole life. So I enjoy talking in a legal context. I'm glad that I'm not part of the profession directly, but it is nice to be here today. So I want to start off by talking about terminology. Okay, so just a few notes around terminology. I want to really hit what it means to be transgender or cisgender. Okay, someone who is transgender or trans is someone whose gender does not match the sex they were assigned at birth. Someone who is cisgender or cis is someone whose gender does match the sex they were assigned at birth. Okay, both of these are actually science terms. Okay, so trans and cis are science terms. Trans means out of alignment and cis means in alignment. So if you studied any organic chemistry in university, you might recognize this example. Here we have a cis atom and a trans atom. So these are descriptive terms. They're not slurs. So if you've ever heard, oh, I don't like to be called cisgender, I think that's a slur. I just want you to know that it's not a slur. It's just a way of talking about our experiences and describing a difference. That's it. Next up, I often get this conversation going around sex versus gender, and it's a complicated idea. And I'm just going to put out the context that I'm working within today. Okay, so here we go. Our sense of gender is actually a function of our brains, and there are other ideas that relate to this and how we actually form the entirety of our gender. But one of the ways that we have of understanding it is as a function of our brains. Okay, this is different from sex. Okay. I am going to show you a colorful picture of a bunch of different genitals. So I do want to give you a heads up that that's coming in case you might be uncomfortable. They're models, they're not actual pictures. Okay. So sex is different from gender because it's not located in our brain. We're talking about our genitals here. Okay. Excuse me. And genitalia are as varied as expressions of gender. Okay. I want to challenge this idea that we have penises and vaginas and that's it. Okay. So one more note around language before we get into the meat and potatoes of today. Okay. I often see people say, you know, I make sure to keep track of preferred names, preferred pronouns, preferred gender. Okay, great. We can do better than that though. Okay. I'm going to challenge you to stop using that preferred piece. Okay, drop that from your vocabulary because our names, our pronouns, and our genders are not optional. They're not a preference. They are what they are, and we want you to see them that way. So for the rest of my portion of this today, I'm going to be talking about this as name and legal name, pronouns, and gender. Okay, no preferred. Okay. So name is a social name, that is not necessarily what is matching on your documentation, whereas legal name is obviously what matches your government documentation. Honorifics, one last thing that comes up a little bit as well. So we all know familiar honorifics like Mr., Miss, Mrs., we even know Doctor, and we know Reverend. There are still others, and I do want to put out there that mix or mixter is often one that is used. So in my teaching practice, my students call me Mix Morse, and they do a great job with that. And it's something that, you know, it just became second nature to them very quickly once they got to know me. But I did want them to really know me authentically. And that's one way that I had of doing that, using that honorific. Okay. The other option that I want to put out there to you folks is that sometimes people don't want to be called something fancy. Sometimes it's not super helpful. Sometimes we actually just want to be called by our name, not anything else. Okay, so providing that option when accessible or necessary is something that I would recommend doing. Okay, client information. We're getting to the good stuff now. Okay, so your clients' names and pronouns are important. When you're working with vulnerable communities like ours, getting names and pronouns right or wrong can dramatically shift the tone of your relationship with a client. When documenting a client's name, legal name, and pronouns, I recommend the following. You want to cut out any use of preferred from forms for the reasons that I've already talked about. You want to allow your clients the opportunity to share their pronouns with you or not. Okay, sometimes sharing pronouns is a really personal thing that people don't want to do. Okay, there's lots of reasons, valid reasons why people may not want to share their pronouns with you. Okay, so third, if a client's name is different from their legal name, the client's name should be prioritized at all times. Okay, the exception is when it's absolutely required to use someone's legal name. Okay, then please do so. Pronoun use. Okay, one way to make it easier for clients to come forward with their own names and pronouns is to normalize that as part of your daily routines. So one of the things that a lot of folks are getting really good at, so everyone, when Hannah was doing introductions today, shared pronouns, and that's something that normalizes pronoun use, and that's awesome. That's what we like to see. So this is often very simple, making this a part of your daily routines. Okay, it can look like simply having this in your email signature. Okay, so adding in pronouns to your email signature. Or actually saying, hey, how are you? My name's Shae Morse. I use they pronouns when you're in the middle of a conversation. Okay, it can be a great way of putting that out there and having the courage to do that. So make that a part of your introductions. Before we get to some of the best practices, I want to talk about making mistakes, and this will be a part of our best practice as well. Okay, so we're all going to make oopsies. It's normal. It's part of life. I've made mistakes with my trans pals, my queer pals, and I'm going to again. The way that we actually get around that is by knowing how to apologize, correcting yourself, and moving on. Okay, so when you make a mistake, this is what I want you to do. Just quickly apologize, a quick sorry. You correct yourself. So if you messed up the pronoun, oh, hey, sorry, Shae was walking down the street. She did this, that, the other thing. Oh, sorry, Shae, you use they pronouns. Let's move on. And that's it. It's a quick correction. You don't need to belabor it. You don't need to make someone feel guilty about it. Okay, because this is often what happens when I hear people make apologies. We want to make this about ourselves because we're good people and we want to convince other people that we're good people, but you don't need to in that moment. What will actually convince someone that you're a good person is if you simply correct your mistake and move on, and then you're good to go. Good to go. Okay, what's really important is that you hit each of these steps. Okay, an apology without correcting yourself can seem really hollow. Most people get tripped up in step number 3. Okay, so that's my warning to you, is that we don't want to make it about ourselves. Okay, we want to make sure our clients are centered always. Next up, barriers. Okay, I have adapted this list from the healthcare context. Okay, so when I was doing research for this, there's not a lot of research being done in specifically the legal context. There's a lot more in healthcare because trans folks have had to advocate loudly for themselves to have access to healthcare for a long time. Okay, so this list is adapted. It's my own, but I think it's valuable and is insightful. So let's talk a little bit about provider competence. An incompetent provider will leave a trans person in a position of having to educate the provider about themselves and their experiences. And that's not something you want a client to have to do. If they do, I highly recommend paying them for that work, because that's work. Okay, I want you to consider that. Provider competence is a big barrier to accessing legal support. A perceived lack of sensitivity to transgender concerns. So for example, this looks like providers expressing transphobic behaviors, intrusive questions or comments unrelated to the legal issues that need to be discussed. Subtler forms of discrimination. So for example, being called the wrong name, pronouns, or gender are called microaggressions, and no doubt we know about those. So those subtle forms of discrimination count, and they are noticed. Environmental barriers. So this looks like restrooms restricted by gender. It looks like a lack of privacy in waiting rooms. It looks like a lack of trans-friendly and inclusive signage in any waiting rooms. Okay, so you want to have a welcoming environment that shows trans and gender non-conforming clients that they belong in your space. Legal paperwork that's not inclusive. Okay, so this goes back to some of the terminology pieces that I talked about at the beginning, where we want to make sure that we have more than just male and female options on our forms, because we know that gender is infinitely more complex than just male or female. Okay, excuse me. One thing that I want to point out, this is not just about your paper copies of records, this is about your record keeping software as well. So your digital software matters too. Your clients want to see themselves represented on paper, but also in your databases. Institutional barriers. This really looks like a lack of policies for transgender people. Okay, having some basic policies to accommodate transgender clients is something that is good practice to have. You want everyone to be on the same page with how they interact with transgender clients. Okay, and this is everyone from administrative staff to partners at the top of the firm. Okay, it also looks like transgender specific concerns not being incorporated into the educational part of any profession. Okay, so in terms of being a teacher, I didn't have a ton of education on working with transgender students, but I should have. Okay, so it's advocating for those changes in our training institutions as well. That is one of those barriers to getting real help for transgender and gender non-conforming folks. Monetary barriers. Okay, this is a big one. Poverty affects 29% of transgender people versus 8.7% of the Canadian population. Okay, so poverty disproportionately affects transgender people. I want to talk a little bit about harassment before I get to our best practices. Okay, I'm doing okay for time. We're doing all right. I'm just about out of time. So we'll get through this pretty quick. I want to talk about two areas when we're looking at the harassment of transgender and non-binary people. Okay, I want to look at schools and I want to look at workplaces. Okay, now when I'm talking about these, unfortunately, there's not a lot of research in the Canadian context. So I've had to access some United States statistics for this. Okay. I would suggest that the experiences of Canadian trans people are very much the same. So let's take a look at schools. More than 3/4 of those who were perceived out or as transgender at some point between kindergarten and grade 12 experienced some form of mistreatment, such as being verbally harassed, prohibited from dressing according to their gender identity, disciplined more harshly, or physically or sexually assaulted because people thought they were transgender. 54% of those who were out or perceived as transgender in kindergarten to grade 12 were verbally harassed. Nearly 1/4 were attacked physically, and 13% were sexually assaulted in kindergarten to 12 because of being transgender. 17% faced such severe mistreatment as a transgender person that they left school. Nearly 1/4 of people who were out or perceived as transgender in college or vocational schools were verbally, physically, or sexually harassed. Okay, so this is not just a grade school issue. It's not just an issue with our young people. It affects our vocational schools, colleges, universities, and as we're about to see, it affects our workplaces too. So 15% of respondents who had a job in the past year were verbally harassed, physically attacked, and or sexually assaulted at work because of their gender identity or expression. Nearly 1/4 of those who had a job in the past year reported other forms of mistreatment based on their gender identity or expression during the year, such as being forced to use a restroom that did not match their gender identity, being told to present in the wrong gender in order to keep a job, or have a boss or coworker share private information about their transgender status without their permission. 30% of respondents who had a job in the past year reported being fired, denied a promotion, or experiencing some other form of mistreatment related to their gender identity or expression. Okay, more than 3/4 of respondents who had a job in the past year took steps to avoid mistreatment in the workplace, such as hiding or delaying their gender transition or quitting their job. More than 3/4, 77%. Okay. So I want to give you some context for the challenges that transgender and gender nonconforming people face throughout their lives. And so if we then apply this to the legal context, this is what we're facing in terms of reaching transgender and non-binary clients. Okay, to be successful with that means pushing back against a lot of years of mistreatment.
Shae, I'm just going to jump in. We have a few questions here. I don't know, do you have the time to answer a few now?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, so we just have one from Miriam. Actually, is just asking, can you please share the stats that you're referencing in school and workplaces? So either that's something you might have here, or I can help send out after the fact as well.
Yes, that is from the 2015 US Transgender Survey from the National Center for Transgender Equality. Okay, so those statistics are there, and I highly encourage checking them out. If anyone has other statistics from the Canadian context that they've accessed, I would love that information. So please pass that along.
Perfect. Okay, maybe I can send that link around as well afterwards.
Sure.
And then just to jump, we have another question here for Janet Dean. I think this is something you're about to talk about, but I work for a Status of Women Council, and we want to be inclusive of all that identify as women. What's the best practice language for communicating that?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think talking about women as women is fine, as long as your idea of women includes both cisgender and transgender women. I've heard a few different groupings of things. I sometimes hear women and non-binary people, if you're intending to mean non-men. Okay. So there's a few different options for that. Let me mull that over, and I can think about that, and I can type an answer later on when I have a little bit more time to think off my feet.
Perfect. Okay, no, thank you so much, Shae. And then just one last one. I'll leave that one up from Janet, and an answer will get typed in there shortly for everyone to see. But in the next one, I just see here, I recently heard a new term, neo-pronouns, and learned there are pronouns such as fae and fair, which I've never heard of. I don't think I would use neo-pronouns correctly. And any advice or tables you can share that explain neo-pronouns and how to use them?
Yes, I do have some resources for that. One organization that I am a really big fan of is the, oh my gosh, I better not mess this up. Trans Student Educational Resources, TSER, Trans Student Educational Resources. They have a bunch of wonderful infographics that I highly recommend that actually help us understand how pronouns work. So I can even just share this really quickly and show you. So let me stop that screen share and do a new share here. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing this with me. So this is one of my favorite little infographics about this. So neopronouns are a thing. They can be difficult to work with. One of the things that I would just put that out there, if you're someone who is worried you're going to mess up neopronouns, stick with someone's name. Just call someone by their name, and that's going to be okay. it can be a little awkward sometimes, but if you say Shae walked down the street to go to the store and Shae walked back from the store, Shae had a load of groceries with them, hey, it works. Okay, so sometimes if you're worried about neopronouns, you can get around that by doing things like talking about someone's name instead. So I highly recommend TSER is great. You should check it out. Fantastic infographics, love it. Check out the Gender Unicorn, highly recommend it.
Perfect, thank you. I just pasted the link as well to that website just in the chat here, and I'll send it around to everyone afterwards too. Thanks so much, Shae.
Fantastic. I'll just quickly wrap up my piece then, and then we will truck right along. Let me get back to this. Okay. Okay, so quickly, I'll just run through best practices and let Shila, well, we'll do a little break first. But here we are. So this is a big one I want to talk about, demonstrating a commitment to equitable hiring and recruitment practices. Okay, so this is actually about making sure that your staff team includes transgender people. Okay, if there's hiring fairs that you're going out for, this is something I want you to keep in mind. Okay, we bring different perspectives to the table. We have different skill sets, and they are valuable, and they can be an asset to your organization. So thinking about that in terms of making a commitment to equitable hiring is something that's really important. Okay, not a lot of folks are including transgender and gender nonconforming people in their list of their list of at-risk or protected classes when we're talking about employment. Develop policies and procedures for transgender clients that discourages stigmatization. Okay, this helps to ensure consistency and fairness when you're working with your transgender clients. You want to make sure that everyone's on the same page. Okay. Offer social support and assistance navigating legal systems. As someone who has navigated legal systems on my own without support, I will tell you that it is incredibly overwhelming. So having someone just to help navigate the systems that you have in place is hugely important in terms of allowing transgender and gender nonconforming folks the best access to your services. Creating a welcoming environment. This is something as simple as the signage on your walls. That's it. Okay, we want to feel like we belong in your space, and that's something that you can do easily to make sure that we feel like we belong. I've touched on this multiple times through, but making sure that you know, our database software and additional gender options are available and consistent across our paperwork and record-keeping software. And ensuring that relevant client information is reviewed prior to meetings. Okay, so making sure that everyone's on the same page, from your administrative staff to, you know, anybody else that needs to know what's going on before the meeting. And last but not least, commit to understanding and doing better when you make mistakes. Okay. That's it for my piece. I do see another question here in the Q&A that I can just answer super quickly. How do you use the pronoun here or zir? Sometimes said her or zer. Actually works kind of the same way as she, her, hers, and hers. Zer, zers, and zers. That's how it conjugates. Just like she, her, they, them, their. It's complicated, but it's an option. That's it for me. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Shae. What a treat. And I know we all wish we had like an additional 3 hours to talk to Shae about the kind of intricacies of this. And yeah, we hope that this spurs some conversation. So before I kind of dive in, I just want to encourage everyone to take a moment and just give yourself a little stretch, do what you need to do to shift your position, take care of your body. So I'm just going to shut off my camera for a few brief moments to encourage you to stretch. And I'll be back in here in like 30 seconds.
Thank you, Heather.
Yeah, Shae is a treat. So I'm going to jump in now and start my side of the presentation. And first, just introduce who I am. My name is Shila LeBlanc, she, her pronouns. And obviously, some of my work is with the Legal Information Society. I also have founded Restorative Approach. So my kind of expertise or area of focus today is on the restorative method. And I'm a queer settler here in Chibouctouc or Halifax. And why restorative approaches? Well, basically this way of
Hey, Shila, just chiming in, you're freezing a little bit there. Just a little bit of audio lag, I think.
how is it now?
Oh, that's good. You're good now.
Back on track.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so what I'm here to do today is to walk you through why a restorative method is really, really helpful when you're working with a marginalized demographic. And this is helpful with the Pride community, the queer community, but also with anyone that you come into contact with. So I will explain what it is, but first I want to give some context to this way of working. Restorative approaches are Indigenous processes. So there's, in the last kind of handful of decades, there's been a lot of interest and kind of formalization of restorative approaches in settler communities. And that's awesome. I think the reason why that's happening is because these ways work so well. But as we've kind of shifted to kind of more formalized ways of this way of working, I think there's been an unfortunate erasure of the Indigenous roots of the restorative ways of being in the world. So restorative approaches are used in Indigenous communities and have been for millennia. They're excellent kind of community-oriented ways of thinking. And in fact, a lot of the kind of formal applications that we see of this way of working are thanks to Indigenous folks themselves supporting settler spaces in creating those processes. So, you know, I like to remind folks in 2021, around 30% of people who are incarcerated are Indigenous, while accounting for only like 3 to 5% of the population. So those are some really significant systemic issues. And I think it's really unfortunate when settler spaces use restorative approaches and don't do adequate acknowledgement of the Indigenous roots. So for me, as a white settler, queer woman doing restorative work all the time, I like to always make sure that there's time to acknowledge this piece and to just say, like, it's a real honor and it's a real pleasure to do restorative work. And I'm really grateful to my Mi'kmaq community here for supporting me in this work. So it's important to recognize and acknowledge that this is not a settler process. And in fact, a lot of the settler ways of doing kind of colonial processes run completely in opposition to being restorative. And we'll learn about why that is. So for those of you who've never heard of the restorative method, restorative approaches, the quickest way to describe it is a relational approach. So the entire kind of view when you're being restorative is to focus on the relationship quality. So you would think like, what's my relationship to this person, to that person? What's my relationship to my organization? What's my relationship to my community? And so restorative approaches in the broadest sense, it's a lens, it's a way of being in the world. And there's kind of a recognition from this way of working that anything that you do, your projects, are only going to be as strong as the relationships underpinning them. And I think we instinctively know this is true. I think we can all imagine a time when we had this like awesome dream team and things went really smoothly. And then also other times when there's disagreement, there's conflict, sometimes conflict and issues that escalate over the span of a project. And it's so true that when you're working collaboratively and cohesively, that those final kind of moments in the project are so much more satisfying and meaningful. So in truth, I think we kind of know that our relationships matter and that it helps to be on board with the folks around us. And yet it's so amazing how rarely we take time to really address the relational side of things. The restorative view understands that we as humans are hardwired to connect. This is a view that's really focused on belonging. and feeling included in a community. And the restorative view or kind of lens is much more about how you get to a certain landing place than the final outcome itself only, which I think is kind of where we tend to operate as like that final product or outcome. So from this way of working, the how we got to that final place matters quite a lot. You want to walk that road to the final thing in a good way. And so, especially now in kind of this late capitalist world, we tend to be really focused on, again, that kind of final piece. And there's a lot of kind of external pressure where like time is money. We want to be as efficient as we can be. And I think ultimately it creates a bit of a transactional quality in our relationships at work. And certainly that there is truth to that. We are all experts and work in a certain kind of area of expertise. But there's a lot to be gained if we actually give some space to the human side of ourselves at work. And I think this like cultural piece around work life being separate is simply not true. We are whole people that come to work as humans. And so when it comes to, especially as Shae was pointing out with the queer community, this idea of just kind of showing up and focusing on that one task without recognizing those other things doesn't really work. And especially with COVID, I'm at home. And so many of us, that line is increasingly blurred. The other thing to know with restorative approaches is that they're increasingly a social science and becoming kind of an area of expertise. So in settler spaces in particular. So I'm excited about that there's kind of an increased kind of data collection thing happening and a lot more examples of it being used formally. So invest in your relationships. So show up for the people in front of you, regardless of whether or not you might understand where they're coming from. And the idea, like I kind of want to be that voice for you today to remind you to like slow down and show up for the folks who are there. And I also want it to be clear in this presentation that it's not just because it's like the right thing to do or a good thing to do. And I think that's true. But I think there's a lot of benefits in our professional world when we do have good, strong relationships with those around us. And so, you know, I think for us, those outcomes, when we do reach those final places in our work, when we do have that team, I think we can all appreciate and know that feeling of the solidarity and community when we go through those things together. So just to kind of outline where restorative approaches are, this is restorative approaches can be also known as practices, principles, or methods. And there's kind of informal and formal applications. So the informal side is things like centering voice and choice, reflective and compassionate listening, using a trauma-informed lens. I cannot recommend this highly enough in terms of training. It's so helpful, especially when it comes to working with the queer community. Oftentimes what might seem like just a lack of participation is really a trauma response. Also informally being restorative means doing your own work so that you show up in a good way. And then there's a lot of formal applications. So things like restorative curriculum in schools. In Nova Scotia, we're really lucky to have formalized curriculum that is restorative. Restorative justice in courts. We're also really trailblazing in Nova Scotia right now for that restorative justice process. You can have restorative policies and procedures, and that kind of ties in with what Shae was saying in terms of having really clear sets of written language around how to interact with different parts of our community. There are Indigenous programs and processes. So in Nova Scotia, we have the Mi'kmaq Legal Support Network and restorative conflict resolution, which is something I really love. But today we're going to talk about informal applications. And it can be a bit kind of tricky to understand how to be restorative, but that's kind of my goal today, is to walk us through those different pieces. So when it comes to this social discipline window, I'll walk you through it. It's kind of a lot to take in. There's on one axis, low to high support. Support can mean things like nurturing, encouraging, participating. And then on the other axis, we have low to high control. So things like control meaning boundary setting, consequences, clear expectations. And this kind of quadrant speaks to basically how we work. So if you're a service provider, this will really kind of maybe help get you thinking a little bit about the ways that you interact with your clients. So up here, we have doing two, which is high control and low support. This is authoritarian and punitive. This is really a service provider saying like my way or the highway. This method can also be kind of coercive. In my view, a lot of the justice system really operates in doing two, and I see this a lot in kind of general services. This corner here is a combination of low control and low support. So that's when someone is just kind of not working for. So it's when you're kind of neglectful, irresponsible. I think we can think of those service providers that are just really checked out. Obviously not very helpful in terms of providing meaningful service. And then over here we have doing four, which is when you have a high support, but not enough kind of boundaries. So this is a service provider kind of going above and beyond for the client when the client isn't actually expressing any interest in doing those things. So again, permissive, paternalistic. And then the kind of golden place that we want to work is working with, so high support and high boundaries and expectations. So up here, this is restorative, authoritative, and we can really imagine this as being firm and warm. This over here doing two is firm and cold. So there's, I think, sometimes confusion between authoritarian and authoritative, but the working with is the restorative method, and it's breaking down that view as you as a service provider inherently knowing what's best, and an appreciation that the person who you're working with knows in terms of their own needs what would best serve their life. So it's kind of getting out of that top-down hierarchy view and appreciating that while you have an area of expertise, the other person you're serving has clear guidance and understanding of what would serve their lives best. So next I'm going to jump into Shila's top 5 ways to be restorative. And as I said, this is so helpful when you're working with people from the gender diverse community, but also just anyone. So the very first thing I recommend is to listen. Seems like a pretty straightforward thing to suggest, but it's kind of unbelievable how rarely we might actually see or how rarely we actually stop and listen. And so a few things I like to get you thinking on when it comes to listening is, first of all, just being mindful of how much space you take up. When you go into a meeting, is there at any point a shift in the person speaking, or is it just you kind of downloading your perspective onto someone else? I also like to ask, when you come out of a meeting with someone, did you learn something new? Was there a deepening of information that you got from that interaction? Or was it, you came out with the same set of understanding as you had going in? And if you didn't learn something new, I think you're really missing opportunities. You're missing opportunities to strengthen your relationships, and you're missing opportunities to learn about perspectives that aren't yours. I think it's that thing where if you're talking, you're not learning. But it's amazing. Like, I think, again, I appreciate it. I struggle to listen because we have things to do, we have demands, and it can feel a little bit tricky sometimes to slow down and listen, but it's really worth it. The third thing I like to say for listening is think about the proportions of a discussion in terms of who's there. So if you're in a conversation with 3 people, you should only speak maybe or aspire to speak a third of the time. So pretty basic, but very vital, especially when it comes to, again, individuals you're working with who have barriers or marginalization. You want to make sure you understand them. So the next recommendation is, again, in the vein of listening, which is very, very helpful. But this is kind of 2 other really helpful ways to listen. One is reflective questions. So a reflective question is basically when someone says something and you reflect it back as a question. And the reason why reflective questions and affirming statements are so helpful is that it creates shared understanding between people that you're talking to. So oftentimes we're talking kind of like across each other. And the goal here is that we actually communicate to the other person that, hey, I do understand what you're saying, and you're clarifying that you do hear. So reflective questions are like someone says, I feel this, that, and the other thing. And then you say, okay, so if I'm hearing you, you feel this, that, and the other thing. You can also ask questions like, okay, so am I correct that it's this? And, in summary, is this kind of the thing you're the most worried about? Would I be right to say this, that, and the other thing? So it's just basically, again, that repetition back, but it will really surprise you sometimes. You want to get a yes, that's what I said. And if you get a no, then it's like, cool, that's great. You realize that you didn't hear them. So then you can ask, okay, sorry, what did you mean? And then, okay, so you meant this? Great. So it's, again, that clarification that's really helpful. And the other piece is affirming statements. So especially when it comes to service professions where people are disclosing heavy things or difficulties, affirming that they're sharing with you will really help. So an affirming statement can just be, thank you for sharing. And especially if it's harder disclosures that folks are making with you, you can say, I'm so sorry to hear that, or that sounds really stressful, or that must be hard for you, or I really appreciate you being here today. So again, it's just these very small ways that really have a big impact when you're working with people. So reflecting back what you hear and affirming what you hear will take you really, really far. And especially when it comes to asking questions around gender, whatever it might be, this is a great way to say like, hey, thank you, I'm here for this. My third recommendation is to focus on voice and choice. So centering the needs of the people you are serving, which sounds basic, but again, it's amazing how many services are like one size fits all. And chances are, if there's only kind of one path that folks have, you're missing a lot of people. There's a lot of people that aren't following that one track. So obviously the voice piece means having lots of opportunities and spaces for folks to express where they are and what they need. So, in meetings, whatever it might be, you want to make sure, again, that there are chances for you to listen and learn. And also choice. So you want to have options as much as possible, and especially ones that aren't in the binary. So you don't want to have this or that. If you can have kind of a spectrum of ways things go, that makes a big difference. And especially when it comes to the legal profession, it's really important to realize that something that might win in a legal stance is not necessarily a win for the individual. So I always like to, in any kind of process I'm working on, say to the person like, hey, we can do this, we could also do that, and then always leave space for the third option to do nothing. Sometimes folks, don't have it in them to do a legal process, and that's okay. So voice and choice also kind of translates to feeling seen and heard. And if people you're working with, if your colleagues, if your clients feel seen and heard, you'll have, I think, a pretty harmonious working world. And I also really recommend checking in, especially in these pandemic days. It's so important to check in. If someone's facing, dire finances, if they're caretaking in the background, if their kids are home and they're trying to work, the likelihood of, moving through a legal process in a good way is very low. So the question I always recommend is, hey, is there anything else that you'd like to share with me? Is there anything else that I should know? And they're pretty basic questions, but you'd be amazed what people share. And it also helps you kind of get a temperature test for, your professional time investment. If someone's in a really bad way, they might not be in a place to see something through. And that's helpful for you to know as well. And especially with your colleagues, it really helps before a meeting to just say, like, take the time to check in with everyone with the option to pass, but asking, how's everyone doing? How is work? How is home? What's going well? What's the struggle? Like those quick check-ins, it's so valuable. And then the final thing that I would recommend to be restorative is get curious and connect. So, in terms of the queer community, it might be really a totally new terrain for you, and that's great. So get curious and really start asking questions to get to know the folks who are around you. And I encourage you to think of one person that you don't know well but would like to know. That can be a client or a colleague. So that can be something that you can experiment with a little bit, is getting closer to someone you're working with. And if you're feeling particularly brave or courageous, think about someone you might not particularly like, and imagine just slowly but surely maybe asking them a couple of questions you hadn't asked them. I think we tend to get really kind of fixed in our stories in our minds about who we're with and who these people are, and they may or may not be true. I think a lot of it might just be in our minds. So it's really helpful to use curiosity as the way to kind of cultivate relationships. I find that's the thing that has really served me. And I think the restorative approach really does recommend is that curiosity. And so the last thing I'll share before we flip into questions, and we're doing pretty good for time, is just that in the restorative view, there's an understanding that harm ripples out. So if something harmful happens, there's kind of always unanticipated kind of negative dominoes that tend to kind of reverberate through a community. But I also like to say to folks that healing ripples outward as well. So when you have good relationships, when you take the time for the people that are showing up around you, when you nurture and foster teams that are cohesive and collaborative, the whole broad community wins. It does ripple out. When we're in a good way, our community is in a better way. So I like to leave on that kind of optimistic note. And that's all I have in terms of presentation. But I do think it's nice to have the restorative piece alongside the queer discussion, because it does kind of foster a more kind of compassionate, humanized, connected way. So yeah, we're now open to questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Shila and Shae. That was fantastic. And just if there's any more questions that want to come in, please feel free to use the chat and the Q&A function. But in the meantime, I did receive actually two questions here. So I'll actually start with Shae. Can you expand on microaggressions? For many of us, microaggressions are commonplace. They seem impossible to tackle one at a time. How should someone respond, or what should they say, and how should they cope?
Yeah. Oh, well, I wish this was a easy question, but I often get this question like, okay, so I've upset somebody by microaggressions. What do I do about it? One thing that I want you to keep in mind is that if you do find yourself in a situation where you have made a mistake, or you've even made a microaggression, doing all those things that you normally do to apologize and smooth over that situation will work here too. It's not like those skills are unvaluable. So I mean, microaggressions are tough, they're real, they wear us down. They suck. I don't know. Shila, anything to add on to that for me?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one, because I think often when folks are kind of the person who is being microaggressive, it's usually out of a place of ignorance. So I think that that's the thing that's really tough, is it's not coming from folks who care usually. So I think that that's the thing, when we can be more educated in a community sense, in a cultural sense, things are better, I think, for everyone.
That's great. Okay. And then we had another question that was for Shila, but yet again, if both of you can absolutely chime in. It says, so restorative justice and conflict resolution, both of these deal with issues of crisis in relationship, and both of these differ somewhat in assumptions, language, and goals. Are you able to expand briefly on any of these differences if you can?
Sure. So very, again, kind of outside of the scope, but restorative justice is usually that kind of formal application within the justice system. So restorative justice can exist informally, but the most common application is that formalized process. Restorative conflict resolution is much more flexible. And that's kind of where I specialize, where it's working with individuals, organizations, when conflict arises that is outside of a very strict set of legal parameters in the court system.
Okay, that's great. Great. And we have a comment, multiple comments about the dog, about Susan being fantastic.
Susan's an angel. We love her.
No, but I appreciate that. And I think just checking here, we're doing fantastic on time, fantastic presenters, very punctual. So I don't see any more questions coming in at the moment. So what we can do is we can always wrap up. Those are the ones that I had here. We're getting a lot of thanks to our panelists.
Any other, yeah, I guess I would just ask, like, are there any examples that folks want to share with the few minutes we have left in terms of things their organization is doing that works? Or any kind of questions or anything like that around what can you do to be more inclusive? Last call for questions, I guess.
Yeah, let's see if anyone has anything else to add here. And if not right now, that's a fantastic question, Shila. It's a great call out. I think that would be really helpful to sort of hear more about as well. So if after the fact, everyone has my contact info, do you want to send that my way? Shae in a race car chair. Shae.
Pretty much.
Pretty much.
I'll also just say too, when this guide is done, we'll obviously circulate it. I'm really excited for that day, but it's not due. As I said, we're running until March 2022. So stay tuned.
Perfect. Yeah, Shila, that's great. If you want to send that my way, I can absolutely circulate that as well. That's great. And I see Laura mentioned that we're training in RJ and practices its use. Just fantastic. Yeah, excited to see this employment guide. Absolutely. Great. Great positive feedback for our panelists today. Thank you so much. That's fantastic. All right, so I guess, like I said, any other questions, any other answers to Shila's call out, which is fantastic. Please give us your feedback, anything else. I know we have some smaller working groups and our check-ins as well as the SHW groups in particular meet and chat about this topic as well. And we'll continue to have that discussion, but thank you so much so far to our panelists. I do want to say thank you so much. And I will be circulating the link. I have received a few messages just to make sure few people have had to dip early, and it will be circulated. And we've had some really great positive feedback. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And like I said as well, I will reach out to everybody, but if anyone has any more questions directly for Shila or Shae, I'm happy to connect you. I'm sure they're happy to answer any other questions. I get the thumbs up, so it looks like we're good. Okay, fantastic. Thanks so much everyone for joining the webinar today, and we'll see you soon. Thanks to our panelists. Bye everyone.